Let's get our hands dirty and write our very first test class. For our first test class, let's cover our Hello World trigger, which I've copied here to remind you how it worked. A few things to note. This trigger runs whenever a lead is updated, and the trigger will simply update the lead's first and last name. Our goal will be to get 100% test coverage. Remember, the minimum requirement is only 75%, which means if we want to deploy this code into our production org, we need to write a test that'll run at least 75% of the lines of code in this trigger. That's all we have to do. Run 75% of the lines of code in this trigger. So, looking at this from a high level, if we write a test class that simply updates a lead, any lead, that'll force this trigger to execute. Let's get started. I'll be coding again in Maven's Mate, my personal favorite coding environment and the most common one I've seen used among Salesforce developers in recent years. Follow along from your own computer as you're really going to need to build some muscle memory here. To create a new test class, we'll go to Maven's Mate, Metadata, New Apex Class. Maven's Mate gives us a list of templates we can use to help us get started. If you're not using Maven's Mate, I recommend manually copying the code instead. Good for muscle memory. In the future, you can Google Apex test class examples and copy code you'd see there to start off. Remember, there's no shame in copying code. Everyone does it. In the template select box, we'll search for test and choose the unit test template. Maven's Mate then prompts us to give our test class a name. We're going to call it Hello World Test, again using the camel case notation. I'm choosing to name this Hello World Test for a few reasons. First, since it's named similarly to our Hello World trigger, it'll be easy to find this test class if we ever need to down the road. Remember, it's common to have a dedicated test class for each trigger. Also, if we ever have a raw list of our triggers and classes, sorting them by name will conveniently pair this test class with our trigger. Like most things in Apex, however, we can name things anything we want. There's no strict rule forcing you to choose a certain name, but we'll move forward with this name since it's a Salesforce best practice. Once the template finishes, you're going to see a bunch of mumbo-jumbo boilerplate code. What you see here is not going to mean much to you now, and it's really not going to mean much to you once you're an expert programmer too. Let me show you the key phrases here that are important, and the rest you can simply ignore. The isTest annotation here is important. Whenever you see the @ sign plus a phrase, you're looking at what's called an annotation. The isTest annotation simply tells Salesforce that we're writing a test class. Salesforce categorizes and treats test classes differently than they treat other code. For example, Salesforce only lets an org have 3 million characters of Apex total. This is a limit I've never seen orgs reach, and I'd be shocked if Salesforce didn't let orgs go over that. Nonetheless, code with the isTest annotation does not count towards that limit. Here we have our Hello World test name for our test class. And you'll see that this template conveniently made 2 test methods for us. We're only going to use one since we have a very simple trigger, but it's common to see multiple test methods used when needing to test different scenarios. All the other text you see here in this template is extracurricular. You can ignore it. Time to get coding. Remember, our goal here is to write code that'll force at least 75% of the lines of code in the Hello World trigger to execute. Since the Hello World trigger runs whenever a lead is updated, all we need to do in this test class is update a lead. This will indirectly make our trigger run, and it'll get us the code coverage we need to deploy. To update a lead, we first need to have a lead. Whenever you're writing test classes, you're writing them on a clean database, meaning no records exist. Even if you have records in the org, they're not available to you in the test class. So you have to create all your records from scratch. This is a best practice for testing in any coding language, since if we relied on existing data, changes to that data might break our test classes. So it's safer to just create our own. Whatever you do in your test class does not get saved permanently in your database, so you don't have to worry about your test data making your org messy. Once your test class is done running, Salesforce conveniently undoes any of the changes you made in your test. All the code we're going to write will happen in the context of our test method here. I'm going to rename it update lead, although this is unnecessary. It just helps us understand what this test method does if we later forget. Since our code will happen in the context of this test method, we make sure all our code is indented. Okay, let's create a lead. We'll create a new lead variable and call it myLead. Since it's a variable, we can name it anything we want, but I'm going to choose myLead. Then we'll set this variable equal to a new lead record using this syntax here. It may look familiar to you because we used a similar syntax to create a task in the Apple Watch trigger and a case in the dedupe reminder trigger. Next, we'll set a few fields on this lead, making sure to set required fields such as last name and company. Since all of these are text fields, we need to wrap their values in single quotes. As usual, don't forget the semicolons too. Finally, we need to physically insert our lead into our org's database, since up till now, it has only existed in our code. Now let's take a pause, save our test class, and give it a whirl to see what happens. Try to guess how much code coverage we'll get in our Hello World trigger with what we've written so far here in our test class. To run our test class, we'll go to Maven's Mate, Unit Testing, Open Apex Test Runner. We'll choose our Hello World test class and run it. Maven's Mate is giving us a warning that we do not have enough test coverage overall. Looking down below, our result is pass. This is only a pass because we did not have any failed assertions. In fact, we didn't have any assertions at all. We'll talk about that later. Let's drill down into our test results to get some better information. 0% is our grade. And clicking the Show Coverage button, we can see exactly which lines of code were not covered. Red everywhere. That's a bad thing. Some lines of code aren't highlighted because they're not important and don't count towards coverage calculations. Nonetheless, we do not have the coverage we need. Why? Easy. Our trigger only runs when leads are updated. All we've done so far is insert a lead. So let's update it. Back to our test class. To update the lead, we'll simply update a field, then save our work by telling Salesforce to update the database with our changes. This should do the trick. Let's save our trigger, bring back the testing UI, and rerun our test class. Drilling down into the results, we now see that we have 100% coverage and no red lines. Congratulations, students, on writing your first successful test class. The Hello World trigger can now be deployed into a production org. That was pretty fun, right? I love writing test classes.